Welcome to the Median Explorers podcast. This is Fredrik Strang. In this episode, I'm elated to take you to the top of the world as well as to the deepest place on Earth, the Challenger Deep, as I speak to record breaker British-American Vanessa O'Brien. Vanessa is a former business executive in the banking world, and exploration was not a certain outcome as it was not in her blood as a youth. During the economic recession in 2009, she decided to quit climbing the corporate ladder and instead, over lunch, a friend of hers suggested, why not climb Everest? Said and done, Vanessa gave herself a time-limited goal to climb Everest, and since then adventure and exploration has been the guiding light in her life. Vanessa's story is truly unique, having gone from Wall Street into the world of adventure with an impressive list of accomplishments. For instance, the fastest woman to complete the Explorer's Grand Slam, which entails the 7 summits and reaching both North and South Pole in merely 295 days. And also being the first American-British woman to successfully summit the second tallest peak in the world, Shugori, also known as K2. Recently, she has been all over the news, as she on June 8 to 9, 2020, along with Katie Sullivan, became the first woman to reach the Challenger Deep, which is known to be the deepest point in the ocean, which makes Vanessa the first woman to reach the highest and lowest points on Earth. She's a fellow of the Royal Geographic Society and a member of the Scientific Exploration Society, and have conducted several research expeditions and charity projects during her time as an explorer. She's not a typical adrenaline junkie, but rather a goal-oriented analytic personality who likes to motivate people to step outside their comfort zone and take calculated risks. What attracted Vanessa in mountains was the stark goal, something so outrageous that would take her some years to train for and overcome. No one can question her impeccable willpower, and once she set a goal, she pursues it with a laser beam focus. I'm eager to discuss where this force derives from, how it can be a force for good alongside with topics as risk management, happiness, loss, and climate change. Vanessa is perhaps the most unlikely person to have become a well-renowned adventurer, going from banking to exploring, and I wonder if Ernest Hemingway had something to do with it, as he exhorts. There are only 3 sports: bullfighting, motor racing, and mountaineering. All the rest are merely games. So without further delay, I bring you Vanessa O'Brien. Welcome, Vanessa. Thank you for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
You're the first woman to stand on top of the tallest mountain in the world and to dive to the deepest trench known to man, called Challenger Deep, 10,925 meters. And everyone wants to know, how did it feel to have 8 tons per square inch pressure around you and touch the bottom seabed?
Well, it's probably a good thing that you can't feel it because it would probably not feel very good. Luckily, our submersible was pressurized, and a bit like an airplane is pressurized. So you can't actually feel it, although you know it is 8 tons, and 8 tons is roughly 16,000 pounds per square inch. But you can hear things, so psychologically you can hear little creaks and things like that. And from my perspective, that's like the say the fiberglass getting kind of crunched a little bit. And as you go down, the creaks are like squeezing of the fiberglass against the titanium. So that's a little bit daunting for the imagination. One of the defining features of the limiting factor, which is what that submersible was called, is it's got 90 millimeters thick titanium on the pressure of the hull. And it's been pressure tested so that it can withstand the pressure. And by the time I got into this machine, it had already been to the deepest depths a number of times. So I wasn't taking, a big risk. I wasn't going first down to the depths in this machine. But nonetheless, there had been remote-controlled vehicles, usually named after Greek, gods or, some sort of sea titans, that had gone to the depths and imploded. So Nereus is one I think of in 2014 that was found imploded under pressure when bits were floating around the top of the ocean after I think it had hit 9,900 meters. So, it's not like these things don't have accidents over time. So that's always sort of in the back of your mind as well.
Having that in top of mind, how in earth can it feel reassuring when you're going down in that piece of machinery, knowing that the statistics, it's possible that it will implode? How do you cope with that stress?
It's interesting, so historically in 1960, before I was born, the first man-made vehicle went down, and that was, two men in a very, very large vehicle, but their space was maybe the size of a refrigerator, a medium-sized refrigerator where their compartment sat. And when they went down, like everything cracked, the windows cracked, it was clumsy, and they hit the bottom, and all the sediment came up, and they couldn't really stay down. And that machine went one time, went up, and was decommissioned. And even 52 years later, when James Cameron went in 2012, his vehicle only went one time, decommissioned. These vehicles never really were meant to go multiple times. So there's that sort of feeling like, okay, how many times can a vehicle, undertake this kind of journey? And you don't really know, because when you're sitting in that submersible, you've got this. The first thing that you understand when you go in, I only went in once before I went down for real, is there's a whole lot of electricity, and electricity and water just don't mix, right? And it's almost like when you go down into the hatch, which is just a tiny little porthole, you sit into something that is probably like maybe the cockpit of an airplane, but along the top is a whole bunch of oxygen bottles, and it's a very, very small space. And there's a whole bunch of lights and a whole bunch of controls, and underwater we use sonar, above water we use radar. But all of these controls and electronics ultimately don't go well with water, and you are surrounded by water, and you're relying on thrusters and batteries and other things. So, you do your best to, remain calm, and you're taught about what to do if, say, the oxygen were to go, and say we were to lose consciousness, and what the backup redundancy systems are. But the reality is it takes 4 hours to get to the bottom, and if we were to lose consciousness and go into an artificial oxygen environment, chances are that there's a system called Watchdog that you have to turn off, and if you don't turn off that noise, the sub will automatically bring you up. And I think the reality is, although nobody likes to talk like this, if you don't turn that signal off and it were to automatically bring you up, it's probably not bringing up somebody that's alive, if you understand that. So I think there's always risks that are taken, even though you know that there's a temporary oxygen bottle and then there's a permanent oxygen bottle. And these things will bring you to the surface, but that there are also situations that might occur with a gas exchange that you might not make it.
Well, there's a gazillion questions I could ask you about this. I have the goosebumps because I can feel the tension, I can feel the constriction, and the awkwardness that must involve in being in such a confined department. But we will leave that and ask for the audience indulgence on this, because before I let you enthuse us with these stories and the highs and lows from Everest to Challenger Deep, your odd but perhaps not surprising conversion from working in the banking world to the inception of your adventurous journeys, polar expeditions inspiring others to realize their own dreams, charity projects, and scientific expeditions, we would like to know a little bit about yourself and your background. So please, who are you? Where do you come from? And how do you come to be?
Sure. Actually, the timing of that question is excellent, because about a year ago, I interviewed with a PhD who was writing a book. And I had no idea what he was going to say based on this interview, but the book's just come out, and it's called Personality Isn't Permanent. And his name is Benjamin Hardy. He's a PhD. And, it's kind of daunting, because you interview with somebody and you're like, okay, well, it's all out there. Like, I have no idea if he's going to, say something positive, negative, if he's going to paint me like as a, good character, a bad character, whatever. But his book, Personality Isn't Permanent, the premise was how to break free from self-limiting beliefs. And, if you wanted to rewrite your story, that your past isn't, you're not constrained by your past. And so what he did was he basically listened to my journey going from, banking and, following a recession and taking up mountaineering. And he starts the book about his journey and how a personality test, which labeled him a color, almost stopped him and his wife from getting married because she was the wrong color, or he was the wrong color for her. And, well, that's funny. It was real at the time, and they can laugh about it now, but they went through a tough time about it then. And probably at some point we've all taken personality tests of one type or another, and he lists a few. So what he does is he looks at who I was then in the banking world, circa 2009, and looks at my personality and my disposition, and how, I devoted all these hours, from like 8 a.m. to 10 p.m. And, I was so busy, I didn't have time for anybody. I was self-absorbed, and it was all about work. And if you had met me then, I wouldn't really have had time for you, not you personally, but just, capital U people, because it was all about work, and I was self-absorbed, and, I was just busy, and I was climbing a corporate ladder. But the person in 2019 is a person who you talk to and hear a lot more about the state of the planet, how glaciers are melting, human potential, and how people have a capacity to change and take responsibility for the planet. And he says the reason for the transformation is more around the difficulty, pain, and frustration that pushed me outside my comfort zone that I experienced in mountaineering. So it's not like I became...
So it wasn't a happenstance. This came incrementally over time, and you became... You more or less created yourself. You didn't became yourself randomly. It was a creation, as far as I interpret.
Correct, because I think in the opening scene, he has me like in Karsten's pyramid having a meltdown. And I'm having the meltdown in the jungle. Like, I've got Wellington boots on, the mud's over my knees. I can't pick my legs up. I'm hitting my head on the trees. I can't look up. I can't look down. It's like 100 degrees. It's mosquito infested. And, I've just never been in an environment like that. And I can't figure out what I can do right. And I remember this scene because I had to throw out like a whole roll of GoPro, which was just profanity. I'm just swearing on the whole thing. It's just a whole slew of profanity.
Some people call it a breakthrough and not a breakdown.
Yeah, it could be a breakthrough, but it was one of probably many moments and many different encounters. But it's like when you put yourself in a situation that's just so grim, and you're pushing like so outside your comfort zone, and you're like, why can't I get a handle on this? What's wrong? And there's so much. It's almost like the triangulation of something that's difficult, painful, and the frustration so important. It's got to be frustrating, because if you're a type A person, things are supposed to come easy to you, right?
So they say.
And here it's not coming easy, and I'm extremely frustrated that it's not coming easy, because I remember pulling my legs so far out of the mud that when I finally get a grip and I smack my head on an overhanging tree, I just can't win. I can't win between the height and the depth. I'm just losing at all angles. And and also my gait, because I'm short, some of the steps I had to step over the logs were just more than I could step. They were more than my 5'4" legs could handle. And it was just shit, actually. But anyway, that's like the scene. And he says, like, when you have enough of those kind of moments, it really does transform you into, somebody who over time, and if you look at me, I've traded a life that was predictable and consistent for one that was more open and adaptable and fluid. And now it was, that was like a great scene, of course, because you're really in a jungle. I mean, more jungle than jungle could ever be. But if you take all of these different scenarios and you put them all together and you say, okay, well, probably for 295 days I lived somewhere on a mountain. I would have experienced living outside for a year in different environments in different countries, and really had to adapt to, what those surroundings were. And that broke the spine of my back of my ego. And when you crack an ego open, new things can form, but you have to do that. You have to do that.
Would you say that now you're more of a friend of uncertainty and adversity and the unknown than you used to?
Yeah, I can definitely handle, so it's not that I'm not goal-oriented and really trying to find purpose, but I don't need to know exactly what that is. I will still think big and want to get involved in projects, but I'm okay with the uncertainty. I'm okay with being open and adaptable. And I'm probably a nicer person.
Let's look in the back mirror and go back 10 years, because I'd like to understand the inception of this adventurous propensity of yours. And you met a friend at a lunch, and this came in a joking manner where the friend of yours made an admonition and an injunction where she said that, why not try Everest? And you apparently jumped on the idea and you realized that. And what do you think would have become of you if you hadn't taken that challenge that day?
Okay, so I do remember this because I've written about it in my new memoir, which is To the Greatest Heights. But I was playing with sort of three things back then. But you sort of have to think about Hong Kong back in 2009, 10, and moving there from London. So I didn't speak the language. And I was surrounded by tall buildings and big hills and human slide walks, I called them, and interconnected malls, right? So, it's very, very different. It's a different environment. And this is let's say 2009. So what is it? 12 years since the handover in 1997, roughly. So there was still some Britishness, like you could still have afternoon tea. It's not like it is now, Hong Kong. It was still a little more British. But I also found a lot of Chinese values there. In other words, what I found about the Chinese is that the Chinese valued money, power, and wealth. And judgment-free zone, they were willing to work hard for it. So there was nothing wrong with that. It was just, that's what I found that they valued. So they put in long hours, and one of the things that came with that was what happened after work. Well, after work, people would go, let's say to the bars, there'd be social sides, but the social sides were all around networking. And for that side of the Hong Kong Chinese, it was, who are you and what can you do for me? And that side of it was more what reminded me of like the film American Psycho, like with the business cards. Okay, so here's my business card, double embossed, whatever, some font. And correctly. And so, but this was like the first time I wasn't working, so I couldn't meet that with a business card. And so I was trying to identify myself, not with a business card, but just who I was, but not by what was on a piece of plastic or, linen or whatever, cotton. So it was kind of an awakening for me to not be described by a business card. And so that's when I started coming up with, how can I define what I do next? Like, I have to have something to do, not just because I'm a type A person, but I can't just be a lady of leisure. That doesn't really work for me. And so when I started trying to come up with sort of parameters of things that I could do next, they were roughly like, okay, well, whatever I do next, I should be able to measure success. It should take 2 to 3 years. It should have a goal and not be financial because we're in a recession and finance is doing bad. And, there were things like that. And so 2 of those things, which is where my path could have led if the friend didn't say Everest, I was looking at, I had always loved skincare. And so I was looking at what if I did a product line with some of the fruits of Asia, which have antioxidants.
With the hand on our heart, mountaineers aren't very good at taking care of their skin.
No, and it's partially because, look, if it's between hanging on that rope or taking out some cream for your face, you're going to go for the rope every time.
That's great.
Myself included.
So you decided for Everest, but what exactly, at what point did you make that decision? What happened? What was going on in your head? Because I guess there must have been some trepidation, second thoughts, or perhaps even looking over the shoulder. What are people going to say?
I was a city girl in the eyes of my friends, London or Hong Kong. So they didn't see me necessarily as somebody who spent time outside. Also, I was terrified of insects, and that, what they didn't understand was that nothing lived at high altitude. So I was completely safe. That was always going to be my secret.
High altitude, no problems, avalanches, bad weather, but the insects,
yeah.
As long as you don't have the insects, I get it.
Yeah, correct. And actually that wasn't 100% true because there were spiders at Choyonyu Base Camp, but never mind. There was, so that there were some things that worked in my favor. And actually there was a mountain vole that came into my tent one time at base camp. But for the most part, nothing lived at high altitude, so I was safe. I think they thought it was just going to be a temporary thing, you get over it or whatever. But some people were judgmental because mountaineers were judgmental. If you succeeded in something right away and it took them a longer time, they were not happy about that. But every once in a while, I'll tell you, there was a super cool story. Like one time, somebody who I never met but completely admired pinged me on social media and said, "You don't know who I am, but I think your story is incredible." And that was Joe Simpson. And I was just like, oh my God, how can you think I don't know who you are? Like, you have the most incredible survival story of the century. And I think, whatever, not even century, but just of all time. So some people would be incredibly kind and courageous and cool, and other people would be judgmental and, unkind.
Do you think there's a part of jealousy involved in that? What people think of you as well?
It can be, but I find it bizarre because I don't know why. It would have to take an insecure person to feel that way. I can't psychoanalyze that, but I have found that the people that, like Nazir Sabir, who would come to me and say, I hate crampons on rock. I mean, I love men who can just be honest and say stuff like that, because it's the truth. My God, who wants crampons on rock? You know what I mean? We should have the James Bond of choices to push a button and get rid of that, because it's all today, right?
And the noise is terrible.
That's just honesty. And or people that say, oh, you shouldn't climb with Sherpas. It's like, my God, are you kidding? Edmund Hillary climbed with a Sherpa. I climb with a Sherpa because none of my friends climb. None of my girlfriends climb, none of my male friends climb. Those aren't my mates. So
it's very hard to find proper people with the right competency on Match.com that fits that kind of a profile too. So I guess that as long as you are honest with how you climb and don't do any exaggerations, well, then people shouldn't have any problem with that.
Everyone has Sherpa on their team, and yet, if I turn around with Sherpa on my team, they hauled me up a mountain. It's hilarious. So it is what it is. But
you're part British, part American. Would you say that you're more British than American? Because I can hear a cup of tea.
Oh,
is that a cup of tea, or is that actually a cup of coffee?
No, that's tea. Sorry about that. You get sound effects.
After all the expeditions that you've been on, aren't you tired of tea?
It's funny. No, I'm not. It's funny. If anything, it's green tea, of course, in Pakistan. So, to have black tea back in England, you get different teas. So I can never, run out of choice.
Something that I wonder about is that you came from the banking world and you left it. You can always go back. Did the fact that you could always go back act as a safety net in case your mountaineering aspiration would go up in flames?
I would say absolutely. Depending on who I'm speaking to, I like to use that example about people making tough decisions in their life. So risk management is not a topic that people go around talking about because it's a foreign term, unless you're talking in a business sense. But the reality is we make decisions every day along a risk continuum. So should I run across the street now before that car comes? That's risk. Do I make that last phone call today? Maybe I'll get that something that I want or something done. Do I pop over to the shop before they run out of milk? These are all, little risk equations. So what's interesting is when I talk about like that safety net, it's really invisible, but I always like people to know that they have it, because so many people remain trapped in their life and they get stuck. They get stuck in like shitty jobs that they don't like and terrible relationships that no longer serve them, and they don't really realize that they can get up and go. And what I always like them to think about is that the skills and knowledge and experience that they have acquired in life throughout their entire life, everything that they've ever done is theirs and no one can take it away from them. So, surprise, it's yours, it's theirs to keep, no one can take it away. So if you pivot left, right, just move from your current position, you have a data point. Once you have the data point, you know whether you like it more than where you were or less than where you were. And that tells you whether to stay or move again. And you can always go back. So if you don't like the relationship, the job, whatever it is, pivot, make a move, you can always go back. But you don't know if you don't move.
I agree totally. But here's the difficult part, because here's a contradiction from famous Arnold Schwarzenegger. And I think you heard this interview before. And he solely states that he hates Plan B, that it reduces the focus from the main goal. What's your take on this?
I love Arnold. I think he's awesome. I follow him on Twitter. He's funny as hell. And I love the sentiment. I would only say I want to know when he's making that statement, because it's a bit like putting all your eggs in one basket. If you're in the middle of something and the eggs are in the basket, then he's right. Okay, let's take an example that we can relate to. Let's say it's January 2020 of this year, and you want to go to K2 in June, right? K2 is one of the many mountains on your list. It's your priority at the moment. Suddenly, let's pretend a global pandemic hits. I know, sounds like I'm making it up, right? You should be flexible with Plan B, right? Because then you go to the fall, and there's Manaslu, Choyoyu, Maklu, Shishapangma. You could do other things in the fall. Because if you were only looking at K2 and they close it off in the summer and you don't have a Plan B, you miss out for the whole year. However, if you were on K2 in June and there was no global pandemic and you're looking at the shit weather hitting every single day, which it does do every single day, and you're wavering and you start looking at Broad Peak, then you will never summit K2. And he's right. No Plan B if you're on K2. If you're in it. Yeah, so I'm saying he's right if you're in it. He's wrong if you're not in it. Do you see the difference?
I think that is profound. And I think that applies to my sentiment as well. That's how I judge these different situations and scenarios. I always promulgate that watch your steps, but every now and then lift your cheeks and lift your eyes to be reminded where you are going and why. I like to go back to the banking world, and here's an interesting philosophical question. I don't want to end up as a promoter for recruiting bankers to become full-time explorers here, but let's imagine for a while that I do. What do you think would happen if more bankers did go out and took physical risks, witnessed breathtaking panoramas in sub-zero temperatures and oxygen-deprived jagged peaks? What do you think would happen to the planet, for instance, if these people went out there? Not only bankers, but people in general.
So I think it's hard to stereotype. I see the queues on Everest. I don't like them either. And while I would never want to stop somebody from fulfilling their dreams of climbing Everest and, having an attempt at the summit, I do caution that everyone who does attempt it train hard and at least attempt one other 8,000 meter peak first. So by the time I climbed Everest, I climbed 2 other 8,000 meter peaks before I summited Everest. Now, I don't actually know where Nepal ended up because it was going back and forth on their final rulings. But it seems like a combination of inexperienced climbers and inexperienced operators, resulted in chaos. And you can imagine a combination of those two is ultimately deadly, right? I think that we do need advocates for climate change, but banker is also a generic term, and that doesn't imply extreme wealth. That person with that label isn't going to be the one to reduce carbon emissions to 2 degrees, or stand up in Glasgow, next time around. I'm not sure this person's going to make a dent in any green industry. And I'm not sure that recruiting bankers is a positive thing to raise money for environmental concerns. So I don't know that as a as a promoter solves any problem in particular. But I will say in general that anybody who experiences mountains or understands them or sees the devastation or understands the statistics does have their eyes opened, and knowledge is a good thing. So that's probably the best way I can sum that. So if anybody who's seen the data from Ishimode about the third of the glaciers has already melted, you can only care about the second third, that's very powerful. That pretty much tells you right there that, no point crying over spilt milk. It's that first third is gone. You can only care about the second third. And when you put it in terms like that, it's like, it hits you, right in the gut. And, we can marvel at them and think about the beauty, but unless we want them all to lose, the snow caps and by the way, all the glaciers that melt will end up feeding, the glaciers and streams and headwaters of all those rivers, and we will end up with some floods. There's repercussions for that. We've got to think about that too. Problems will come down the line from that as well. But targeting bankers, I don't know. I don't know that anything good comes of that per se.
You lack the skill set for surviving in some of the most hostile and extreme places on Earth, climbing competence, etc. And your approach was, which I love, I can go and learn that. But I'd like to know, how was that skills? How did you acquire these skill sets? Did you set a time-limited goal of 2 years or 1 to 2 years? Did you go to a school? Did you go to guides and learn these skill sets, or how was your strategy?
Okay, so basically, I saw climbing as a skill, and a skill is something that can be learned and therefore taught. So I think that's probably a little bit different when I talk to other people. They don't necessarily look at it like that, and I think that's a refreshing way to look at it. So I wasn't, although I did not know how to climb. When the subject of climbing came up, it wasn't, the first thing that hit me was not, oh no, I can't do this, I don't know how. Because of the business background, I approached it very analytically and said, climbing, what is climbing? Climbing is a skill, and a skill can be learned and therefore taught. That was like just my left brain analysis of the situation. Then I went into something a little softer, which was I didn't know whether I'd be any good at it or like it. And even those have different dimensions of protection. Good at it is, whether I'd be good or not good, and like it or not like it. But I also realized over time that it takes practice. And if you live in a city, you can't really go on an indoor climbing wall and pretend that's outdoor climbing. Those are completely different. And in fact, like even when I realized that more, especially on high altitude climbs, they were more mixed climbs in the end because of climate change. I had wanted more and more practice of crampon on rock. And I finally found some individuals to train with in Canada and in Colorado, and I would specifically ask them to take me where I could go for crampon on rock. And it was hard because I would be damaging, the mountains. And, that this wasn't a particular nice thing that they wanted to do. They didn't want to go, scratch up a bunch of, living rock, so to speak, but there was occasionally places I could go off the beaten track and do that. But I wanted to practice for House's Chimney. I wanted to practice for other bits of technical places where, I wouldn't just be experiencing it for the first time, because normally when you climb rock, you're not in crampons. So, but anyway, so the first time I ever put on a helmet, a harness, boots, crampons, anything like that was in New Zealand with Mark Sedan. And I have a chapter about that in the book, the memoir that I wrote called To the Greatest Heights. It's been postponed because of COVID, so it will now be released in March 2021. But I've given him a very, very heavy accent, which is funny because he does not have an accent like that, but I gave him one, which is funny. But he was relentless because he made me practice over and over and over and over again, up and down the ice, up and down the ice, feet splaying, more horizontal the more vertical the ice. French technique, front pointing, how not to front point to burn out your calves, that kind of thing. We stayed in huts, moving up on the ice, short roping, rappelling, and we even had like a fun reconnaissance descent where, he got a little lost, which I found really cool because I always found when the guides didn't know where they were, that was the most fun for me. Because you got to really see them apply their skill, and then they were always a little extra nervous, which I always love to see the psychological aspects of that. So, yeah, but that was it. But I would learn that the business skills were not enough.
And the business skills you're referring to, there are leadership, strategy, risk management, ability.
Yeah, any of those things that you could have all the business skills in the world, but you still needed technical skills, and you still have to honor Mother Nature and have patience and realize that you will not always be in control.
So how useful has these business skills been in the mountaineering arena for you?
Yeah, so they've been, the business skills have been very helpful. Like, so I took those three, the famous ones from Jack Welch, speed, simplicity, and self-confidence. And those were Jack Welch's famous, big three. And I couldn't even read his books because this was so ingrained, where we worked. But if you think about it, speed on a mountain is very important because, as Mesner always said, mountains aren't fair or unfair, they're just dangerous, right? So it's nothing personal. But there's hazards, crevasses, avalanches, changing weather patterns, technical climbing sections. You have to get the hell out. You have to climb with efficiency. So you don't want to go too fast where you make mistakes, but you want to do it with purpose. And so, there is an element of speed, because speed is your friend, because you just don't know how it's going to change. And change is just always in the air. It's with wind. It's sun melts. When you have melting snow and ice, that's dangerous. So speed is your friend. Now, is there ever times when you want to go slow? Sure. When you're doing heart surgery, it's probably a good time to go slow. The other one was simplicity. If I give you a complicated set of instructions, are you happier than a simpler one? Probably not. Also, when you have different cultures, different languages, you want to be simple. Simple is always better, always. Self-confidence. I think people need self-confidence. I'd rather have somebody be self-confidently wrong than. Do you understand what I'm about to say? Yes.
I get your point.
Just have the self-confidence. I don't even care if you're wrong, but be self-confident. Because,
and hopefully that person will understand that he or she was wrong in the first place and can change.
Yes, but the point is, if you lack the self-confidence, then you won't have enough self-confidence probably to even change your opinion. You'll be too insecure to change that. But it's important, and self-confidence, part of it comes with experience. Part of it comes with, making mistakes. It's good to make mistakes if you learn from them. But it's an important thing to do, for sure. And, but I would say, what the mountain taught me that business did not teach me was patience. I was not a patient person. The mountain taught me patience. And it also taught me that I was not in control. And business teaches you at all times that you must be in control. And the mountain tells you that indeed the mountain, Gaia, Mother Nature is in control. And you are going to have a much easier time if you understand that. If you try to control everything, you're going to be a miserable person.
So if you would go back to the banking world today with these virtues that mountaineering has taught you and all the experience you have firsthand, would that make you a better banker, you think?
Probably not, because I don't think I could put up with probably some of the bureaucracy or some of the I think in the business world, even when I just, listen to my partner or something like that on the phone, he puts up with a lot of business, a lot of meetings, a lot of indecision, a lot of, times he's sitting there and nobody's making decisions, a lot of, I'll call it bureaucracy for lack of a better word. But on a mountain, that can't happen. If you try to superimpose a business model on a mountain model, there are no summits. Businesses will not summit because you can't have a bunch of people just discussing stuff in perpetuity. You've got to make decisions and you've got to go forward as a team. I see a lot of people just sitting there discussing stuff in perpetuity, but they don't have clear goals and objectives. They're not operating as a team. They're not aligned, and that's I just don't see summits.
Do you think that disparity is frustrating for a lot of people, and that in fact makes them bail?
So what I see on the mountain is I see. It's the opposite on the mountain, funny enough. What I see on the mountain is I see fear spreading. So what happens is, they'll hear like, oh, there's no chance, the weather looks horrible, and then it'll spread from one camp to the other. No weather window, and then somebody will start coughing, and in their head, they'll start looking at their, what they're missing back home. And it'll be like, oh, but so-and-so's birthday's coming up. And, but so-and-so's birthday was always coming up, right? You were always going to be gone. But suddenly, like, they're feeling worse and they want to go home and they're getting homesick and they're manufacturing in their head this downward spiraling, situation where there's never going to be a weather window. They're missing stuff at home, and now they're getting more sick, and they want to go home. But there are no doors on tents. So they can always go home. But they lose focus. They lose focus on the summit. They lose focus on the goal. And when that fear starts to spread, it's like wildfire. You can't put it out. And if I could and I had my way, I wouldn't even allow teams to, talk to each other because I can't stop the fear from spreading. But what I would rather do is have the games, have the movies, have the card games, and keep everybody focused on the summit and not all the negative news. Because the mind, it looks for reasons to fail, not reasons to succeed. Because it's easier to. It's like that little angel and little devil on the shoulder, that the little devil's just he or she is just a little bit more convincing because it takes less work and it's the path of least resistance. It takes more work to succeed, in this case, to go up.
You say that people often get their wows for the wrong reason when they congratulate you for being the fastest woman to complete the 7 summits and all the other amazing achievements that you've done. What do you mean with this?
Usually that there's a backstory, and some people don't see the backstories. So, and so like, one example is, take the Guinness World Record for the fastest woman to climb the 7 summits. That I didn't know that there was a Guinness World Record, and that's what's actually the funniest bit about the WOW is I didn't know about it until I was trying to fill 400 explorer names for the United Nations and looking up 400 names. And so I was Googling, my husband was Googling, and we were trying to replace the country names at ECOSOC chambers at the United Nations. And if you think about it, like you could probably come up with 50, but when you get to like 400, you're like, I need names. And we were Googling, and my husband found that I had the Guinness World Record. We didn't know it. And that's like, to me, what makes it funny. It's like, it's like shit.
So you weren't actually dedicating to set the world record in the first place. No, it just happened to be so.
So I had been made aware that if I had climbed Kilimanjaro twice, I would be eligible for it. So I did do that, but they were just really bad at communicating and didn't confirm, or tell me about it. So I never knew. And that's how I found out. So it was, and this is in the book, and it's kind of funny, but there's so many things like that. Like, when I did K2, it should have been like an awesome moment. Like, okay, here's a good, story, this, American and British woman. But no, Outside Magazine, does their first profile on me, but not about like this amazing woman. They do one about like a 52-year-old who has a bunch of injuries, right? A slightly backhanded slap, right? But that leads to Simon and Schuster, like, finding me and leading to the book. So, in a funny rounded way, like it was a shit story from my perspective versus what they should have written, but it led to something good anyway. And there's even like a backstory about, Challenger Deep, with the guardian angel and stuff like that. So there's like the backstories that end up happening to me, I think, are always more funnier and more of a wow than what actually ends up happening to me, even though those end up as a headline.
Now let's talk about some inspirational sources. You've said that there are two people in particular that made a great impact on you, and that's Wanda Rutschkiewicz from Lithuania. And she became the first woman to summit K2 without supplemental oxygen. And another person is the Japanese woman, Juko Tabei. Why these amazing, well, they are amazing in their own right, but in what way have they inspired you so much?
Yeah, so it's, first I love them because, at least Google gave them both doodles, which I thought was awesome. So if you look at the Google doodles, and this is where you go into a search engine, and they both had their very own little doodle. So on a certain day, an anniversary of their climb, you would have seen just an animation of them, which I think I still have on my website somewhere. I took copies of their doodles. But so starting with Junko, she finished climbing her 7 summits at the age of 52, which is where I finished K2. So she finished what one would have considered late, in life. She's also very short. She's only 4'9". And I always believe that short climbers don't get an advantage because, you're taking 2 steps for every other person's 1 step. Your gait is short. And also you just don't get the same handholds. You're always having to find other ones. She was also born in 1939, which is really early. So she would have climbed Everest in the 70s. That's like Bonington years. And frankly, there weren't a lot of women climbing in those that time. So she would have broke norms in society, like Japan and Japanese culture, and for a woman. Wanda's a little different. So Wanda, she summited K2 not in 88 but in 86. And if you look at the year 86, I mean, that is a really recent year. Song of the year for 86 was Rock Me Amadeus. Film of the year was Top Gun. So these don't sound like they're a million years ago. these are things that happened not frequently, but not so long ago. Chernobyl happened in 1986. Space Shuttle Challenger blew up because of the O-ring in 1986. And I think I would have liked to meet Wanda for a couple of reasons, and I can relate to her. She had Polish heritage. My father's side is Polish. She lost her brother when they were young. I lost my brother when he was young. And she led, all women teams, which, I always admired from her. And she succeeded on K2 on her third attempt, and it took me 3 attempts too on K2. So I see a lot of parallels with her on her story. And also there's a great story. I don't know if you've ever heard this about Wanda, but before she went to K2, I believe on her first time, there's a story about a teenage boy that rings her apartment's door, and he gives her a bouquet of flowers and a wrapped gift. And then he leaves. And inside the box, there's 100,000 zloty, the Polish money. And there's a note. And the note says, use this money for your next mountain venture. And may it be in such good style as Mount Everest. So in the 80s, that was a huge amount of money. And it allowed her to finance the entire expedition to K2, which was a women's only expedition. So I just think I love that story. I love the fact that, somebody just sent, 100,000, of cash even. You know what I mean? And anonymous.
Yeah. And no one ever found out who that person was. Out. Wow. It almost feels like magic.
But I love that. I love that story. And, it goes to show that there's, that there are sort of magical, moments, and I think that's amazing. So really, I think both women were phenomenal and, pioneers and, contributed greatly to mountaineering.
So are there too few women in adventure sports?
So it's interesting. I think first you have to define adventure sports, team-oriented versus solo, action sports, extreme sports, adventure sports. There's so many terms that get kicked around. I no longer know what that means, except that I guess activities will probably involve a high degree of risk. So I tried to sort of Google that, and at least under extreme sports, it seems to involve speed, height, a high degree of physical exertion, or highly specialized gear. So how's that? And luckily, mountaineering was listed. So usually we're completely forgotten. And I'd say that's at least a good thing. It doesn't really help women because I think extreme sports or adventure sports, it's still highly underfunded. And as long as it's highly underfunded, you're not going to get people to participate in these events because I think they're amazing events to showcase because very rarely can you ever get a brand, to the top of a mountain with these types of, human elements, working hard, all the effort that goes into preparing and, training, so it's not even the effort of getting something to the top, but all of everything that goes into preparing for that and training for that. There's only a few times, that somebody can do that and put a brand there, for example. But brands shy away from risk, and they definitely shy away from having a brand associated with death. And they would it doesn't matter how little the ask is at that point, they don't want to be associated with it. And, if I think about Uli Steck, Uli Steck had a financial brand associated when he was on Everest last. And, I was so happy to see that I think it was a private bank, had finally stood up and supported him. And, nobody will remember that name of that private bank. And they, I think if anything, people would applaud the fact that, sponsors stuck with him at the end. So I would just only like to say that, of course, the brands can, have whatever they want contractually to say that, no family or the individual is not going to come after them. But more importantly, how much people appreciate when you are with the individual.
I'd like to touch on something that you mentioned a couple of minutes ago. One of your earlier experiences was that you were facing the death of your brother, who died in a boating accident. My sincere condolences. I've also experienced this unfathomable type of thing in my family where my sister died from anorexia a couple of years ago. What happened to you after this moment in your life?
Yeah, sure. Well, he was probably 14 years old, something like that. He was swimming from one sailboat to another sailboat when he noticed a powerboat coming between the two sailboats. He was a really good swimmer, so and a lot of this I'm deriving from many police reports written afterwards. But he decided to dive for it under the water. I think he probably thought he couldn't go back and he couldn't go forward, so he went under the water. So both people on the sailboat started yelling at the driver of the boat to stop. But it turned out the driver and the passenger had been drinking and didn't really notice the kids yelling. So the body got caught in the engine and shut off. And I think the driver, according to the testimonies, thought he hit like driftwood or something like that. But when they went around and looked, they saw blood, and I think one might have pulled the body up and saw an open chest wound and dropped the body. So it was lost for about 3 days, and search boats and nets dragged for it, but it washed up on the rocks, I think, 3 days later. So the result of that is I think it upsets the natural order of things. And so, and what I mean by that is people expect, grandparents to die before parents, and parents to die before children. So when that doesn't happen, it can be very upsetting. And I had very, very young parents. So my parents were, probably 18, when they had kids. So it was a little bit like kids having kids, and they couldn't really, get over like the death of the son type of thing. So they divorced and, moved out of the house because it just reminded them of my brother, and, left me in the house for the rest of high school. And, I think if I remember correctly, my father would come and pick up bills and stuff like that and drop off some like money, and, I was taken care of in that I had a roof over my head, but my friends became my nuclear family and stuff like that. So I was a little bit estranged from my parents, but they provided, food, clothing, and shelter, that kind of thing.
I can't imagine. I can't imagine what you've been going through. But would you say that defined part of who Vanessa is today?
Probably, because, I think, oh God, who's the guy who always says it's never too late to have a happy childhood or whatever? I mean, I can't not have had that experience. So, it's normal for me, but I know it's not normal at large. So, I definitely had more responsibility than other people did, but that is normal for me. And but it also it was interesting because there was a fork in the road where I could completely mess up my life or not mess it up. And, it was interesting to know, like, when no one's watching, who are you when no one's watching? Because, when you're, 15 years old, it's like you have your first, drink, and you have your first, whatever drugs, or, and the point is, it's like, that's the time when you could start something that could be really detrimental and end up where you don't want to go. Or you could go just enough to where you can come back, or, you know what I mean? It's like, but there isn't going to be anybody to save you. And I think I was always conscious of, that it's all on me. And maybe not, so back to that safety net, I hadn't quite had all the knowledge, skills, and experience yet that could really help me yet. So I really felt like things that I do would have bigger, longer, bigger lasting repercussions. Not even like today, because there wasn't social media. It's not like we had there wasn't iPhones with cameras. But, if you think about it, I could have, had really bad grades, or dropped out of school, or, I don't know. There were certainly lots of drugs and other things. I just probably never liked a drug more enough to do more than once or twice, type of thing.
If you could rate your level of happiness today, with a life pursuing your adventurous spirit, let's say from 1 to 10, where 10 is nirvana, what rating would you give yourself?
So today, probably a 9, just because I'm a perfectionist. And I always figure there's something else that would make it a 10, so I'm going to hold that 10 out there as, there's got to be something else, like, as yet undiscovered.
And what kind of rating would you give yourself prior your adventurous career, when you were in the banking world?
Probably a 5, because it was just such an awful treadmill. You were never really ever done or fulfilled, or, you never got that sense of accomplishment. And maybe that's the difference is, at least now, you can say, okay, wow, okay, something's been completed, and you can say, I feel great because I was able to do X. And by the way, it doesn't have to be a summit. Each of those 3 years on K2, if I hadn't failed on the 2 previous years, I would have never developed an appreciation for Pakistan, for example. So, part of the failure of Pakistan was an inverse relationship with, developing a love and appreciation of the country of Pakistan, and that would never have happened if I went in immediately and summited K2.
Owl has been a mediator who say that Mount Everest is not one's ultimate key to finding happiness, and that such fixation indeed jeopardizes sound judgments, and not to forget, put others in unnecessary risks. At the same time, I think one must balance this with being very committed and resolute. How do you find such balance between committing but also being happy and on the safe side?
I think that's fair, because when I first went to Everest, I was definitely not prepared. I signed up for Camp 2, which I think is just a stupid offering.
Sounds like an insult.
Yeah. Because the way they sell Everest is like base camp, Camp 2, and summit. And, the problem is if you look at it just from a, just an altitude equation, and let's say you climb Kilimanjaro, well, Kilimanjaro is higher than Everest Base Camp. So, and Everest Base Camp is just a trek. You're not on the ice or snow or anything. So you're tempted to go higher. as I was. I climbed Kilimanjaro. I wanted to go to Camp 2. But the problem is the first thing out of base camp is that Khumbu Icefall. That's no place, right, to have people who don't know what they're doing. And unless you really know Everest well, you can't really get an appreciation and understanding for that. And I fell right into that trap. I'm only going, 1,000 feet higher. I've been higher. I know this, I know that, whatever. It's just, it's a stupid thing. So, I think if you want to go to Everest, you have to be prepared. You got to be strong. You got to know about high altitude. The most important thing is if you want to climb Everest, start slowly, build confidence, start hiking, take in summits, go to the Alps in the winter, go in the summer, go to Scotland, then try an 8,000 meter peak. And if you still like it, then try Everest. That's what I recommend. Like I said, I don't want to take Everest away from anybody. You could also try, I don't want to say that. I was going to say you could try the North Face, but let's not give China a plug. Let's just keep it in Nepal. But just do it when you're ready. Make sure you do an 8,000 meter peak so you understand what altitude is, because it's a totally different experience, and you have to understand what your body does at altitude and what it feels like, and then go. But you don't want to go. I don't think you want to go for base camp, and you don't want to go to Camp 2 and do stupid stuff. You want to go when you're ready.
There are plenty of lessons that have taught me to persevere and handle adversities. And one metaphor I'm often reminded about when I'm struggling on 8,000 meter peaks is that there might be 100 reasons to turn around, but sometimes only one to continue. And applied to mountaineering, that reason could be as simple as the view when I get a little bit higher up. If there are 100 reasons for you to turn around, and none of them are of any safety concerns, what is the reason that keeps you pushing and continuing upwards and onwards?
So that's a great question, because there are going to be, a million reasons to turn around, and you're going to have that negative voice that comes in that tells you, you've been higher, you're hungry, you're tired, you're thirsty, turn around, and you're going to have to get rid of that negative voice. So first, I think the best thing that I do is to climb for myself. And I don't want to let myself down. And I've told myself before that I can and I will do this. So now it's time that I'm going to deliver. So the first thing is that I'm the customer, and that's important. I remember reading once a profound statement from a child actor who said, "Never do something for the applause of others." And I really love that, because nothing will disappoint you more. So, that's sort of the first premise is I've made a promise to myself, and I want to do that. Now, I also don't climb alone. I'm not a soloist. So I know that there's somebody with me who also has, similar, dreams and desires and goals. And I know that person, as long as we're heading in the same direction, also wants to do a similar thing. So I think about, the partner that I have and, that person succeeding. In my backpack will be other ancillary customers. These could be national flags or, UN women or other constituents, somebody else that I want to demonstrate, success to. And, I think about, almost playing forward, the unveiling of, bringing those things back to them. And so I try to think about, almost like the having, having that moment, like anybody who summited knows what that feels like. So replaying that experience, but also anybody who summited knows that that's only halfway, and that the hardest part is getting down. So, it's just trying to get to that halfway point. And sometimes that's very, very hard. But also, I do try sometimes to get into something called the zone, and we could talk about that in a little bit too. There might be some other questions that lead to that, but just try not to think about exactly where you are, and that makes it a little bit easier to continue.
It's like being in the zone. Suddenly, you are looking backwards, and you're trying to figure out how on earth did I end up here. This verticals just happen so quickly. You are just being transported somehow miraculously to a different point, and you can't recall climbing those steps. I often get in that kind of zone where it's a little bit as a blur, the past minutes. Not that I lose my attentiveness or my focus, it's just that I can't recall because I'm so much absorbed in the now. Does this sound weird to you, or do you have similar experience?
No, definitely a similar experience. In fact, there was the first time I ever saw it. There is something called, I think, flow is a psychological term for it. And it's where you are doing something with hyper focus. And when you're in this hyper focus, you lose complete sense of time. And that's why, 4 hours can go by and feel like 15 minutes, let's say. But the good thing is, in addition to losing the sense of time, you're also, I think, endorphins and things like come in where you are also feeling less pain. So you don't feel like, that hungry, thirsty, cold, all those other things that you would normally feel where you are. So there are people that actually get into that sense of flow. I definitely do it. And I didn't realize I did it until I heard somebody speak about it, and then I thought, oh my God, this is exactly what happens. Because how else could I possibly stand somewhere for 16 hours in the worst conditions in the world and not be conscious of it? So it's a good thing to have, but I think you also have to be aware of it, because I think it can also, be damaging if you don't want to flow to your deaths, for example.
Picked up some words in a video about you where you say that it doesn't matter if you do something the fastest or if you are really being the first, as long as it communicates a message to inspire change. And this evokes numerous thoughts in my mind. Firstly, what change are we talking about here? And secondly, does not being the first and fastest give you a unique platform to convey this message to others?
Yeah, so that was a campaign. I know exactly what video that came from, and I think, first of all, that was more about trying to find a purpose beyond a single goal. So, for example, let's say I have a goal, and my goal is to climb K2, and the fastest to climb the 7 summits, or whatever my goal is. It could be any goal. The problem with having a single goal is once you meet it, then you come home and you're depressed because you've just met your goal and it's over. And, to create, sort of lasting change and to be, sort of bigger than that, it's really to have a series, or something greater, like a sense of purpose. So, and I think that's what happens is people would come off the mountains a lot of times, and they come home and they go into this depression, and the depression would be like, well, I don't understand. I just did something, but I'm really depressed. And, people couldn't really understand like why that would happen. Well, part of it is because where you are is really intense. So you're always switched on. You're on 100% of the time. You're always looking for something to go wrong. You're looking for an avalanche. You're looking for sounds, sights, smells, something always on. And then suddenly you go home to something that's very serene and simple. And the biggest decision is, what type of cereal to pick in the supermarket, that kind of thing. And, it's completely different what you're having to, confront. But also when you go home, you are also in a state of, not being, having to manage something, or lead something that, has great stakes attached to it. Whereas purpose, I think, is a better way to look at it, because, our lives don't end at a point in time. It's a continuum. So, basically we come off a mountain and we say, okay, that was a great experience. What did I learn from that? What can I take away? What can I do better? What would I like to do next? And as you think about some of those things, you add what you've done, and take some of those experiences, and you look around and you see what's out there and you say, okay. And sometimes it's a bit like, I look at them almost like film sets. Like, sometimes you take other people that you've come across and you recombine them and do different things, or sometimes they're even different things. Like, I wouldn't necessarily have thought oceans would come up for me. But it's still climate and the environment. But you take things that you care about, and when projects resurface, you put them together and then you're off. But they might have a common theme. So for me, that, the mountains and the oceans had a common theme of environmental, mixed with climate change. But what mattered more was that I continued to change and evolve and have a sense of purpose, not so much, whether I did this, that, or the other.
You use a hashtag, quote, "Oh, your tomorrow." What are you hoping will happen if people in general dedicate themselves to this mantra?
Okay, so I remember that specifically because I was approached for that campaign, and it was called Own Your Tomorrow. And I thought it was interesting because I liked the messaging. I found it empowering, own your tomorrow. You don't really have to say anything else. I also liked the project because it was being produced and filmed by a Dutch storyteller who lived in New York City. And hi, hold on one sec. Sorry, we're going to have to do that over. Perfect, thank you. Actually, the tea just came. You're always laughing about the tea.
Right on time. I don't have any doubts that you are a fanatic tea drinker.
It's very funny because I was like, I left the door open so they wouldn't say anything, and here they are, like, like
same procedure as yesterday, or
yep, exact same.
A different type of tea?
Nope, it's exact same.
Same.
Yeah. So let me start over. But I was approached that campaign, Own Your Tomorrow, and I thought it was interesting because I liked the messaging. I found it empowering, and I liked the project because it was being produced and filmed by a Dutch storyteller who lived in New York City named Bas Burkhout. And what I liked about him is I had seen some of his material, and he always approached every single subject in a really interesting way and told the stories very differently. So his idea for me was, let's go to the mountains. And the closest mountain we could get to was really New Hampshire, which we did. But he wanted everything. He wanted to train. He wanted to hang out in the apartment. He wanted to go to the mountains. Like, he just wanted to fully, get into that world. And then he wanted to, kind of talk to me separate from filming and do like the voiceovers with the film. So it wasn't necessarily what I was saying, but, he would use the image differently. But ultimately, all of his stuff was pretty cool. I liked his artistic ability. And look, it was 3 simple words, but it had one meaning, and what was there not to like? That's the way I looked at it.
I like it. I think it's the messaging is pretty stark and apparent. Goes without saying, so to speak.
Yeah, I wasn't paid for it, but I just liked it. It was just material, and at the time I didn't have a lot of film, so people were always like, "Oh, show me something," and it was like, okay, it gave me material.
Well, you used to live in Boston.
Yes.
And that is not exactly the most mountainous place on Earth. And I heard that you ran up and down office buildings to obtain the vertical gains to be fit for your climbs. Now, me in the contrary, I'm spoiled with running up and down with Grandeur Vista, where I train in my backyard, which is in the Swedish mountains. And sometimes I go on training camps to Norway and Alps. But what I like to understand is how your training regime looked like from a day-to-day basis, basically. And I'm particularly interested in your office building workouts.
Yeah.
And this is perhaps something that many do not fully understand, but running up and down office buildings, how do you maintain the spark and motivation hurtling up and down dead boring stairways in a city?
Yeah. Well, so first, why stairs? Because first, training in a city is much harder. There's more excuses. There's kind of more things to take your attention away. You see a cafe or a bookstore or something, you're like, oh, let's go in there. It's like, no, you got to train. And climbing is simply that you're trying to simulate what you're actually going to be doing. And the problem with rotating stairs that you see in a gym or sliding skis, that you see in a gym is that they're not capturing quite the same momentum as you lifting your leg and having to carry your weight.
And you can always be distracted by 400 TV channels, which is not the case in 8,000 meter peaks.
Yeah, so, I love that they try to simulate it, but the reality is, those things are helping you in one way or another, carry some of that weight, and I really want to be carrying my own weight. So first, before Boston was London, and what's really interesting about London is they do have a series of the deepest tube stations, and there's two of them really, Covent Garden and Hampstead Heath. And if you go to Hampstead Heath, which is in Camden, it has 320 steps down. So they built these things, to really, really withstand the bombs. And I used to go up and down Camden, in Hampstead Heath, and it wasn't long before a station manager would come on and say, hey, are you training for Everest?
Are you serious?
Oh, yeah. And I loved it because he would just go, oh, yeah, I've had lots of those over the years. It was like nothing to these guys. They'd clock you because there'd be nobody mad enough to do that underground in the heat. So that would always make me laugh because leave it to the Brits to have a sense of humor and to know exactly what you're up to. But when I came to Boston, it was like, all right, now what am I going to do? There's nothing within a radius, but they did start wars. So the New England soldiers certainly fought the British Army, all over Boston. So the first thing I saw was a large monument, and the Bunker Hill Monument. So I thought, okay, I'll go climb that. That's 294 steps. And the problem with monuments is they're effectively tourist traps. So, I'd go at a time I thought, okay, nobody's possibly going to want to go to see a site, at these odd hours. And, I'd get somewhere because I want to go fast or with purpose or, get a momentum going. And sure enough, I'd come up or down and there's a group of 3 or a group of 4 or a group of 5 and they're, struggling and, I'd have to go sideways or stop or, and it just would kill, the workout because I'm not doing it once. I want to do it 5 times, right? So that was, that just sucked actually. And then I came across 100 Federal Street, and the people that had the top of this building was the Boston College Club. And I was not an alumni of that, but it was a social club that used to run events. They had a great view of the city. They ran, a wine club. They had, different talks and stuff like that. And my husband had joined with his firm, and we were there one day And the general manager was a sweetheart, a woman who would hang around and sort of get to know her clients. And one day, I was telling her what I was struggling with, and she said, well, why don't you think about our staircase, in the building, because they had 40 floors. It was a sky rise. And I was like, oh my God, that would be awesome, because rain or shine or whatever, a staircase, why not? What I didn't realize is that what I would come to realize is that most buildings, don't really air condition or heat their staircases because it's considered a cost, right? And nor do they really have cameras in them. I'd find all sorts of shit. I'd find like cigarette butts, cockroaches, you name it. Like, people would even over time, have me spy and tell me who was smoking in there, like what floor and what people and, but at the end of it, what she did was she said, let me go to the head of facilities. And since Bank of America was the main tenant and who had the building, she said, let me ask him. As it turned out, he saw himself as a former, quote, superhero. And that was good luck because he was very empathetic. And so he said, it works for me. I just want you to sign a waiver. If you die on the premises, it's not my fault. And, give me a doctor's note. So done and done. And so I started there. And one of the funniest moments was when Mitt Romney was running for president in 2012. I was training with a weighted vest with all these tiny little pockets for little 2-ounce weights. And, had the shorts on, and I probably looked like a police officer with the vest and, all this stuff. And German shepherds running around. Nobody was allowed in. They were doing the bomb stuff. But I'm in because I have the pass. And, my husband comes in after work with guests, and he's not allowed in. And I'm just sort of mouthing like, sorry, like on the other side of the ropes, and just carried on in the staircase. I always had all access, and it was just very funny. But there I went. And then when I got to New York, I was fortunate to meet Bernardo Office Management because they own and operate their real estate, and they gave me access to One Penn Plaza. And that's where I trained for K2. And K2, One Penn Plaza, of course, was bigger, New York City skyrise now. And what was interesting, they would give me an employee badge, and I would take the tallest staircase. And they had something every year called a fireman's run, where the employees of the building would run for charity for lung cancer. And so the people at the desk always just thought I was an employee training for the lung cancer run. And then finally one day I came, I think it was maybe 5 times, and I came up and down, and suddenly one of the guys called me over. He was like, Vanessa O'Brien? I was like, yeah. And I kind of walked over there, and he points to his laptop, and he's like, is this you? And I was like, oh no. And he had Google up, and he's like, you're not really running for the lung cancer thing, are you? And I was like, guilty as charged, no. And I said, what made you look that up? And he's like, you were going way too fast. It was just really, really funny. He's like, you're in here way too often. You go way too fast, and nobody else is like that dedicated to the lung cancer run. But there are downsides to climbing a staircase because you're always going in one direction. So one side is a little bit more, built. Like, let's say you're always turning right, and one side's a little bit more, I'd say slightly stronger, so you get a little bit jaded. But you can break the monotony by skipping steps, playing games, counting, using music, using a weighted vest. Like, I would play games all the time.
So how many stairs in total was the longest office building?
Oh, God. Probably, 1,000 something. And the thing is, over time, I wouldn't count the stairs. I'd look at the floors. Like if it was 55 floors, there might be so many stairs per floor, and they swing around. And it was it was just trying to know, like, if you're halfway, like, can I keep, running, or not running, but, trotting or whatever your pace is, this many floors before I have to, walk. You know, but it's funny. Up is always easier than down, as you probably know, because down is can do your knees in a little bit more. So
yeah, it's treacherous for the knees. It's easy if you don't take care of and place your feet diligently. You can mess them up.
Yeah.
I've had some problems with my knees in the past. It's very important to take good care of the knees.
Yeah. So over time, I think maybe like I would do 3 up, 3 down, and then maybe the last 2 just up only, and take the elevator down.
Well, everyone knows how to prepare for 8,000. That's gaining a lot of vertical gains. However, what about going to the North and the South Pole? You must be dragging tires behind you. What kind of sceneries happened in Boston when you were pulling tires, or was that in London as well?
No, that was Boston. But it's so the big difference between high altitude and polar is really, I guess, how you train. So if you think about high altitude, you're going into an environment that's difficult to breathe. So that is the limiting factor, and the cardiovascular strength becomes more important than weightlifting. So I'd even go so far as to say excess muscle, and excess here, competes with the limited resource of oxygen, because that limited oxygen has to go to your brain, heart, and lungs. So the body type that wins at high altitude is the marathon man, not the bodybuilder. And so 8,000 meters, you want cardio, and you want VO2 max, HIIT, the high intensity interval training. You want aerobic fitness. You want short periods of intense anaerobic exercise with less recovery periods, that kind of thing, where you can build up your cardio endurance. For the polar stuff, and that's hard. Nobody likes to feel that lactic acid, feeling. But when you're pulling sleds, you can go the other way, especially if you're going coastal, 700 kilometers versus, last degree, 111 kilometers, because it's a different kind of endurance. You've got to pull the sleds. The sleds are heavy. You're going to wake up every day pulling a sled. You're going to be packing it and pulling it again, and you want a few pounds of muscle, and you want fat to keep you warm, so you got to put on some weight. You need the leg and back strength. You need the core strength. You need your arm and chest strength, and you need to keep moving. Both of those environments are really cold, so you want heavy weights, lower reps, but you still have to concentrate on breathing because you don't want to overheat, and the layering because you don't want to overheat, or you're going to end up with climbing in a material that will turn to ice. So I'd say they're just very different.
So the Grand Slam is reaching the 7 summits and the North and the South Pole. I'm curious, when does this idea emerge?
Yes. So David Hempelman Adams was the first to do that in 1998. He was just over 40 years old at the time. That's way before I would do it. I would do it in 2013. And by that time, there were 40 people on the list. I didn't invent it. There were 2 different, some people called it Adventurers Grand Slam, some called it Explorers Grand Slam. All I really did was bring structure to it by, investing in a URL, building a website, reaching out to everybody on the list to see if they wanted to add anything about themselves. And really the only people I couldn't verify were the Chinese. 1 or 2 I could, but for the most part, they were hard to find. There's a whole lot of variation in the work that you do. If you go 7 summits plus coastal poles versus non-coastal poles. So, I split the people out so that you could see sort of 3 lists today. If you look on the website, you'll see 12 people who have done the 7 summits plus full North and full South Pole coasts. And then you'll see maybe like 8 or 9 people who have only skied from one coast. So that means they've done the 7 summits plus either, the North Pole or the South Pole, fully coastal, and the last degree. And then 49 people who've done just last degree both. But it's a terrible job because, I mostly end up being the one that says no to somebody who says, hey, I flew to the pole, or I ran a marathon, or I did a half degree. Why can't I be added? And it's like, look, it's very clear what these other people have done. If you want to be part of this, you have to do these things. And I get shit all the time, but all I'm doing is trying to create a group of people who did the same thing. And but you'd be surprised how many times people try to break that. And it's like, it's not that. If you want to do something else, create something else. Otherwise, there's no way to compare.
Do you think that some of these people weren't aware of the fact they were doing the Grand Slam at the time? Or were they just collecting these summits and going to the North and the South Pole just for the fun of it? Is there a possibility?
Oh, correct. Yeah, I didn't know what Explorers Grand Slam was. I didn't hear about that until I think Stuart Smith was the one who told me on Shishapangma. I had no idea what it was. Because as you climb, you run into people, and then people introduce you to more concepts, and then you learn what they are. And you think, okay, well, I probably will never do that. But suddenly you're on Vincent, and you realize, wait a minute, I'll probably never be in Antarctica again. So if I'm going to be in Antarctica, could I not do the South Pole? And once you're committed to the South Pole, you think, well, shit, is the other one the one melting? I probably should go and see that. Because that's actually, everybody was worried about the South Pole because of, at one point that was where all the problems were. But today it's very much the Arctic.
Which of the 7 summits was hardest for you? And believe it or not, when I did 7 summits, ironically, Kilimanjaro of all the mountains faced me with some severe problems. I had explosive diarrhea for many, many days, and I was uncertain whether or not I should reach the top. You went back twice to Kilimanjaro, I've heard.
Yeah, absolutely. And I had diarrhea on my second time too, so I totally get that. And
you're in the same club.
Yeah, and I can tell you that climbing with diarrhea is the worst, because for exactly those reasons, you're so bloated, and as you're going higher, it's getting worse. And I completely recommend that people turn around. And I had to leave the team to go a little faster because it was the last of my 7 summits, so I could do it. But I just, wow, it's not fun.
The takeaway from this is never underestimate a mountain.
Yeah, completely. So I think for me, I was thinking about this. I was prepared for Everest. So, people want to vote Everest for that because you just do so much work for Everest. But the reality is that I was prepared for Everest. I was not prepared for how hard Karsten's Pyramid was going to be. And so I probably have to give Karsten's Pyramid the vote here. It started with, a motorcycle ride. Evel Knievel picks me out of the lineup. It starts pouring rain, and, we stop, and I pull out my rain jacket. I hand it to him for a second so I can put everything back in the backpack, and he puts it on. I'm not joking. He puts on my rain jacket, and I'm so embarrassed. I don't say anything. So, I'm nothing if not a gentleman, right? So we continue to the spot, and, literally, it's just mud, canopies of jungle, heat, humidity, one hand for an umbrella for the massive rain, one hand for a walking stick for the mud, constantly hitting my head, slipping, balancing, crossing rivers. I mean, poor Kurt Wedberg, he had frostbitten toes. Every time there was a log to cross, he shimmied on his butt across the logs because he didn't trust his toes. And, and the negotiation with the Mani and Dani tribes were hilarious because the women were allowed to compete, but all the men just followed them. They let the women work and followed them to the camps. It was absolutely hilarious. And then, that GoPro roll of film I just threw away because it was filled with profanity. And, here I am, I ripped my rain pants and, right in the middle and, mooned everybody all day. It was just awful, awful. Everything that could go wrong would go wrong.
When I hear you, it sounds just like a comedy show.
Oh, it would be a great Monty Python skit. It is. If I could do the hairdressers equivalent.
Exactly.
But with the tribal,
legendary.
Correct. It's too funny. It's everything is just hilarious, and we do get held for ransom 3 times. So, and I do try the international language of chocolate, which was, interesting. But yeah.
Did it work?
It was interesting. It worked for a short time, but when you have fire and axes and machetes, it's that's a little bit more powerful. Steel over chocolate.
The chocolate is mightier than the pen.
Exactly.
There's a lot of things that you also conducted in the name of science, and you contributed to a number of research and scientific projects. You've been investigating the effects of nocturnal hypoxic exposure on high altitude mountaineering, for instance. That was on Manaslu.
Yep.
And the testing of thinning of high altitude glaciers. That was on the Goodwin-Austen Glacier in Pakistan. And illustrating the impact of climate change at the equator in advance of COP 21 in conjunction with Project 250. There's a lot of research expeditions. What did the teams learn from these scientific expeditions?
Yeah, so basically, I think today, if I can help it at all, I really like to conduct science on an expedition because I realize that scientists don't really have the money or the time, nor frankly do they want to risk their life to get what they need. And we're going there. So it occurred to me one day that we are like the stunt men and women for the scientists. Go ahead, lower us into the crevasse, take us down in the submersible. We'll take the risk and we'll get the data. We've just never really put these two things together, but they're a perfect match. And then we're able to give something back to the world, and it's a great evolution, which transforms, I think, an adventurer to an explorer, and also helps bring science, advanced science, which is great. And I think everybody is up for this if they know how to do it. Yeah. So if you take Challenger Deep, I'm part of a team mapping the pool, and we might come to that in a little bit. For the glacier samples on the Karakoram, basically I was testing for radiogenic isotopes, and that's basically to see if there's lead content in the ice. And depending on the type of lead that shows up, we can age the ice. So every single event that might have taken place over time had a different type of lead. So if it were the nuclear tests in the 60s, that's very different than the type of lead that would have come out of Fukushima, let's say. So it's an old way of doing it, in a slightly clumsy way of doing it, but at least you can tell maybe what was responsible. And because what was responsible had a time date stamp on it, therefore, what the age is. So let me give you an example. When I took the glacier samples, I started with 10 liters. Now, that year we had an accident with the rock fall, and I lost 2 liters. Okay. Huh. So that's okay, but I still had 8. So I went 8 liters down. And in those 8 liters down, I was able to take that back, these samples, and what they did was they went and ran a mass spectrometer and looked for the type of lead content. Now, they didn't know what they'd find, but they did find eventually the same type of lead content from Fukushima.
Interesting.
Now, what's great about that is they also had found it in the Tibetan Plateau, which is not so far from the Karakoram. So what they were able to see was, okay, when Fukushima happened, that was two events almost simultaneously. That was a tsunami and an earthquake. And so you had effectively air pollutants and water pollutants, but the air pollutants that would have ended up in the glaciers would have gone up in the westerlies, and over, say, 21 days ended up in these plateaus and in these glaciers. Now, that event took place in 2011, so effectively going down 8 liters is telling me that ice is not new ice. It is new ice, rather. It's not old ice. And also it tells you that it's mildly contaminated, right? So we're boiling water.
But these findings are baffling because we are really a small planet when you consider these atoms and these molecules being transported with the winds and now dispersed over an enormous area. But still we can see the effects of these pollutants from a small geographical place, and it's been distributed all over the planet. That really makes us understand how everything is interconnected.
Yeah, correct. So if you think of the planet as Gaia, one world, one planet, one ocean, there is no isolated event. Anything that happens somewhere, especially nuclear, that this will affect you, whoever you are, wherever you are, will feel that. It's not Japan's problem, I guess is what I mean to say. It might have happened in Japan. But make no mistake, our weather patterns and our ocean patterns will make sure that any catastrophe that happens anywhere in the world will show up on your doorstep. And so the person that ran that was the U.S. Geological Survey in Denver, Colorado. Yeah, absolutely. And so that's just like one example. Now, you can also use yourself as an experiment, and this is fun too. So, one thing that was quite popular at the time was the hypoxic tents, and you could use these at sea level to, quote, give yourself a head start. If you're going to go at high altitude, why not, put a hypoxic tent over your bed and pump up the altitude. So I did a study with Mass General Hospital, and the problem with a lot of the hypoxic offerings is that they are not hypobaric, meaning that they are not going through an oxygen exchange. What they're doing is they're adjusting nitrogen. So it would be extremely expensive to have hypobaric chambers in every bedroom, as you can imagine. These are really only military and, few and far between. Maybe each country has, a couple of them. But most people don't really understand that. So when they say, oh, you're at 20,000, feet or meters, or 5,000, 6,000 meters, 20,000 feet, whatever you are, you think you're now that there's some sort of oxygen exchange taking place, but really, in effect, they're only changing the nitrogen. So you wake up feeling like shit, let's say. But the reality is if you don't change the oxygen, you're not going to get a change in EPO, and your red blood cells are not going to increase. So if you're taking, as I did with Mass General, you're taking blood before and after and during these experiments, you can see that, in fact, you might be worse off. So I was worse off. But having said that, let me tell you a little interesting thing. There's something called a placebo effect. And that is if you're given preferential treatment. So I'm given a hypoxic tent and I'm not shown my results before or after, but I'm told it will work. And I believe it will work because I'm given something special. This can be powerful enough to convince your mind that it's working. So, this did happen to me because I absolutely, all my statistics were worse off. I went to Manaslu thinking I was better off. And so psychologically, I was performing like I was better off, even though physically I was worse off. So it's
astounding.
It's amazing what your head can do to overrule the body, because that's how powerful the head is. Because when I came back and I saw the actual statistics, I was like, oh my God, thank God I didn't see that. Because if I had saw that, I absolutely would have performed worse.
But at Manaslu, do you recall that you were functioning and performing well? You didn't experience any severe headaches or symptoms of high altitude?
No, it wasn't. I mean, toward the very, very end, I tried to come down from the summit all in one go, and we were quite knackered, and it was a hard slog, and I probably misjudged the time of day and came back in the dark. I didn't really like that. What I would say is, if you're interested in doing science, is join something like SES. To me is great, Scientific and Exploration Society. SES.org, founded in the 60s and 70s. It's more focused on the future than the past. Organizations like that can help you, like liaise with people who are universities, not-for-profit think tanks, set you up with partners for stuff like this, and at least put you with your peer group so you can liaise with other people and say, hey, I'm going here. What do you think people would be interested in this place?
Very good recommendation. I'm sure there are many out there who find this very interesting and what advice.
Yeah, just get involved, because you can use yourself as an experiment, or you can always, I even did Diamox and high altitude to see that there's a direct correlation between Diamox and kidney stones. There's all sorts of stuff you can do. There's so much that's not known, let me put it that way.
Let's jump to K2, and K2, second tallest mountain in the world. You made it to the top of this formidable mountain on your third attempt. Here's the million-dollar question. If you could have looked into the crystal ball and seen the future before you first bit, knowing that it would take you 3 tries before you reach the top, would you still have done it?
It's a great question. I think the answer would be no. I would not knowingly want to climb K2 3 times. But without the crystal ball, getting one camp higher each year, there's always additional data, and with that comes hope. And what going to Pakistan did over 3 years was introduce me to, amazing country, amazing people, and helped me build strong friendships that I still have today. So in hindsight, there's no regret, but the question laid out as it is, I wouldn't knowingly want to do it 3 times.
I've been there 4 times now, not planning on my 5th attempt. You mentioned lead on the glaciers and the pollutants. What I found is that I can't stand the lack of hygiene on these obscure places. So whenever I go to Pakistan, I always get the stomach bug, and it just ruins my entire expeditions. Doesn't matter how fit I am, how well prepared I am, how cautious and how much due diligence has been in the entire project, I seem to fail. When you were doing some studies, did you encounter particles or germs or bacteria that's not supposed to be there?
We didn't look for them, but I remember that last year, People started off sick with, kind of nasal infections and stuff that wouldn't go away. They came from Nangma Parabet first, Fairy Meadows. And, my base camp cook couldn't really shake that off. So, it is tough. And it's not the kind of thing that is easily cured. And of course, any antibiotics have side effects. So, that's not always a good answer either.
Maybe the placebo will work good on that too.
Yeah, exactly. That would be good if I could have one of those for my head. But what happened in the end? Did you end up climbing? You climbed Broad Peak.
I summited Broad Peak on my third attempt. First try was 2012. Second one was in 2017 when I met you on K2. We didn't reach the top. We were probably something like 30 meters short from the main summit, vertical. But it was a good 40 minutes, scramble, traverse to the main summit. So it doesn't count as true summit assault. So I went back in 2018 and summited with my friend David Reske. And finally climbing the last remaining meters. So Broad Peak has been testing my patience and my karma for a long time. I'm not sure whether K2 will ever let me linger on its top. So I politely say thank you, but no thank you for any more expeditions to K2. There are so much other amazing things that I can you do with my time and my fitness.
Yeah, of course.
Climbing K2 it's like fitness peels off of you like water on a ghost. It's just amazing. You come back and you're fatter percentage wise than when you got to the mountain in the first place. It's just not very good for health or any fitness whatsoever. But you finally made it. You finally made it on the third try. Were you happy?
Yes, of course, absolutely. We worked really hard to get that summit in 2017. People did ask if it was summit fever. The only thing I can say is maybe. We did check each other at least twice on the way up to see if everyone was all right, and asked every single person if anyone wanted to turn around. Plus, we eyeballed behavior, of everyone along the way. I always have to stress that our summit was normal because people forget about the 16 hours, because 2004, Adurni Pasaban was 15 hours, arriving at 5 a.m., 2014, the 3 female Sherpa took 16 hours, arriving at 3:30. Our team took 16 hours, arriving 4:45. That's just how long a summit takes. So it's just that they don't happen all that often, so people forget and they don't think these are normal. But it is worth, normal doesn't mean that things couldn't be improved. And that's where I always look back and I say, okay, I always look and say, okay, what could I have done differently, or what could have been better? And for me, the learning is, when I went in 2015, I went in a large international group, and I realized that I would never summit K2 in a large mixed international group, because to summit K2 would take more risk. And in a large international group, you're only as good as your weakest link, regardless of who the leader is. So it was not about the leader. It was that they were going to have to manage to the lowest common denominator. So I led the team the next year in 2016, but I made an important discovery. And that was, regardless of how much I thought I was in control, when an avalanche took place at Camp 3, I realized that I didn't really control my resources, i.e. the Sherpa, as much as I thought I did, because when the avalanche happened, both Di Gilbert and I were running expeditions, and we both found that our Sherpa were wanting to do what the other Sherpa were doing, which was go home. So it was basically Mingma from Seven Summits who sat down with us and said, both of your problems are that the Sherpa don't see you as regular full-time employees. And it was quite insightful. Actually, he was doing us a favor by being very point blank and honest with us. Because we were looking to stay, and we were looking to see, would he potentially does he have resources that could stay with us? We were looking at all sorts of different things that might work. But he was quite honest. He's like, look, and it makes sense. People aren't going to go the extra mile for you if they don't work with you every year. So when I finally went up that final year, I partnered with the Sherpa I had met the year before. And, we agreed that I'd take the K2 permit, he'd take the Nangma Parbat permit. We'd leverage my Pakistan relationships. And the most important thing for both of us was that we'd be self-sufficient. And as a Sherpa, he'd be in charge of the Sherpa. So in terms of what could have been improved, it comes down to, when I look at the things that happened, and you look at mountain stories and things that had happened over time, it starts from the beginning. Because when we all arrive, and my Sherpa team starts with Nangma Parbat, they come over to K2 with frostbitten toes. And that's a big warning and worry for me. Because a lot of the team's goal and my goal is definitely K2. But we had a really, really interesting time where, as we were departing to thread the summit window, and I remember seeing you at Camp 2, so you might have actually already been up there for the summit window. But as we were heading up for the actual summit bid, the lead Sherpa said to me, well, is it possible that we can wait at Camp 3 just one night so the Chesson team can catch up to us? And then we can put ropes in to the summit together. And I'm thinking, wait a minute. Our number one, parameter was to be self-sufficient. This team on Chesson is climbing a different route. The team's one day behind. So far, hasn't been terribly successful in climbing that route. Chesson's always hard. And we're threading a weather window needle, So I just asked one question, and that was, what is it that you don't have that you need? Being in charge of the Sherpa team. And he said nothing. And I said, then I would say no, because it's too risky. I'm responsible for this team. You're responsible for this team. And sure enough, we get to Camp 3 and nobody's there. I'm not saying they're easy decisions. I'm saying that you have to make a decision. When we go for the summit from Camp 4, I asked Dawa, who's with me, to short rope me because we're not moving. And what do I see? I see the two guys in the front are the only two that are not on oxygen. They're leading the fixing team.
And they are without supplemental oxygen. They're going without oxygen, and they are the leaders.
They're leading the fixing team, exactly. So are they going faster or slower? Slower. So I went up to the lead Sherpa, who's in charge of the Sherpa, and saying, what are you doing? They're going slower. They should not be in front. It's not that they're not good, but they're not on oxygen. And we should be leapfrogging. There should be a team ahead. So it was the Pakistani that told me that they didn't bring enough rope.
That seems to be notorious for K2.
Oh my God.
You went to the summit and miraculously the clouds disappeared.
The clouds disappeared. Exactly.
And this was, I think, was it 4:30? And I remember we were sitting in base camp. I just turned around because I was going without oxygen and carrying ropes to Camp 3. And I concluded and made the assessment that this is too much risk. We saw some slab avalanches, etc. in Camp 3, and we were not prepared to, jeopardize climbing higher in fog and in poor visibility. But coming down, we were just praying for you guys. And actually, down in base camp, it was quite nice. But there was this cloud that was surrounding the summit, and you were walking in this cloud. And then you came up, and I'm getting the goosebumps here.
Yeah.
How in earth did that feel? It must have been, the lucky shot. Perhaps there was a reason for that slow motion, and so you could have this $1 million view on the summit.
There is that. Is it Rene Dumal who says, what's above knows what's below, but what's below does not know what's above? It's a very powerful phrase because, who knew that we would climb out, if you will, of the weather, into the bluebird day, that the skies would just open and it would just be, fantastic and beautiful, and for the rest of the climb, down back to Camp 4. But we didn't know that. The weather forecast didn't say that. We were climbing through shit most of the way. It was, in fact, I always did a cartoon. Political cartoons are, they'll get you killed in some countries, but yeah, but I
speaking, yes.
Yeah, correct. And so I always had this sort of one cartoon where I felt like, because I came down and so many people said, I was praying for you, I was praying for you, I was praying for you. And I said, I know you were, because I got there and the bluebird day opened up. But, somebody would say, I was praying, to Allah for you. And somebody else said, I was praying, to God or Jesus, or I was praying to Buddha or somebody. And so suddenly I saw all these men, and they were always men, up in the clouds, and, another request for Vanessa, and then who the hell is she? Like, in all these mixed religions. And suddenly it was like, confused channels up at the top, and, just this funny little cartoon of, I guess we got to let this one go kind of thing. But anyway, very, very, very cute. But I said to everybody that I knew they did because of what happened with the sky.
We can speak hours about this, and it's all very interesting. And but I'm sure that the audience is curious, out of reach, and we can't restrain ourselves from this anymore. Let's go from touching the sky to venture down to the abyss, to the Challenger Deep, which is 10,925 meters. At least that's the depth you went to.
Yep.
You joined the Claden Oceanic Ring of Fire expedition to the Pacific Ocean.
Yes.
And you were there to serve at the bottom of 3 pools that constitute Challenger Deep. And that was in a partnership with NOAA. So on June 12th, 2020, you descended together with Victor Versova and Kathy Sullivan. And you went to the eastern pole. Apparently, the eastern pole has the deepest depth. And you're spending 3 hours mapping the bottom with the dive scanning. That's approximately 1 mile of desolate bottom terrain. And you found out that the surface is not flat. In fact, it's tilting a little bit. What I'd like to know is how many years of diligent work does it take to do this? How do you prepare for this in the first place?
So let's see. I had met Victor in 2013. So I had known him for 7 years. He is part of the Explorers Grand Slam. So you will see his name on the Explorers Grand Slam. He's done the 7 summits and the last degree to North and South Pole. In fact, he'll laugh and tell you that I tried to take him off because I forgot I met him and forgot his name. And 2 years later, when he tried to put himself up on the website, and I was like, hold on, you didn't prove that you did the North and South Pole, and I'm always like, really,
giving him a hard time.
I gave him a hard time. So he tells the story like, that I was, an impossible person because I kept trying to take his name off and made him prove his North and South Pole kind of thing. But that's fine. But the reality is when we met, he went off to do 5 deeps. I went off to do 5 8,000ers, and our lives came together and then diverged. But also we didn't live in the same place. He was in the middle of, the U.S. state. I went back and forth between London and New York. And so, there wasn't always, time to, to bump into people either. So what happened is in 2019, he had completed sort of the end of his 5 deeps, and I saw him in Portugal. Where he was speaking, and at the tail end of it, and it was Lisbon, and I basically said something like, would you ever go back? And he said he didn't think he'd go back, but he was running out the door and sort of give him a call, that kind of thing. So. I ended up chatting to him, and what he was really looking to do was go to space. So
I know where this is going, Vanessa.
Yeah, so he was like, I've done all the diving. I'd actually just like to go to space. So he had his eye on something called the Explorer's Trifecta. So he wanted to go to space, do the trench, and kind of, he's done his Everest thing, and that was his next thing. And I said, well, that's great, but you're way ahead of me. I think there's so much more to do when I've been looking at the oceans, and it's amazing to me that 90% is still unmapped. And these vehicles only went one way one time. You've got the only vehicle that can continue to dive. And so he talked about wanting to sell it and all of this stuff, but look, he spent $40 million building it, so there aren't a lot of buyers. And so anyway, long story short, I think he looked around and went and saw if he could find some buyers. And then next thing I knew, he was looking to put together another dive, and with space in mind, had talked to Kathy, and Kathy, of course, was an ambassador of space, having, gone to space herself, and he had lined her up. And since that was already something that he was planning to do, it was easy to add myself to the team, because now an expedition was taking place. To have any sort of proper data, even on one pool, which could be, 20 meters long, you still have to draw maybe 4 lines and do, 4 transects to get valuable data. So he'd need multiple divers, and to get as many different divers as possible, there's just a, sort of a different validation. So he just started, looking for a team that would, partner with NOAA. And the goal really was not new species. The goal was just to map the bottom of that deepest trench, and look at the salinity, the temperature, and the depth, and see what's down there. So,
but you did encounter some new species, did you?
No, not new species. We had seen, polychaetes, which are they're a form of like a bristleworm, which was more on the lander, not actually on our submersible. We caught that on a camera of a lander. And there were certainly things that were coming up in the sand as we did the transect. But I wouldn't say they were new. There's definitely life down there, and it's incredible because of the 16,000 pounds per square inch.
And they look like aliens.
And yeah, they're all weird looking because, let's face it, it's completely dark. There's so much pressure, so you don't need eyes, and so much pressure you can't really form a proper vertebrae. So, what kind of creature would you design? If you gave that to a child and said, okay, you don't need eyes, you don't need a spine. And some of them just look weird. They look weird because you don't have to worry about what you look like.
Well, even if they have mirrors, they can look at themselves in the mirror. It's too dark.
Yeah, exactly. So they're interesting.
Is there a way we can compare climbing to the top of the world, summiting Mount Everest, with going to the very lowest place on Earth?
So I sort of tried to do that a little bit. I mean, what I saw was, look, both are high risk. And what I mean by that is, look, if you say like for every 4 that climb K2, 1 dies, that's just statistics. But, you're going to that much pressure, something could implode. You're taking a risk one way or another. They're both in the dark. Funny enough, we climb in the dark, and of course, that deep is in the dark. They're both cold, right? You go up in the mountains and you're going deep in the ocean. It's cold. Although I will say, people kept saying, "Oh, it's very, very cold," and there's a picture of me in the sub, like in a t-shirt, like heading to the bottom. I'm like, this is not mountaineering cold. If you keep your feet warm, you're fine. But really, if I had worn like all the stuff people were putting in my head, I would have been seriously sweating. Both involve cramped spaces. Like, you could be in a tent with like 3 people, but here you're in a sub, like cramped with, 2 people. Both can get you wet, right? So there's condensation in a sub, dripping on your head or something like that. And of course, you're always kind of a little bit wet when you're climbing. I always joke that both have pressure, in one way or another. There's pressure underwater, but there's pressure climbing. Neither have oxygen. There's no oxygen underwater, and there's no oxygen as you climb high. So I like to compare them. I think they're very similar, but they're, of course, completely different.
I think that many of us got aggravated when we saw the disturbing images from Victor Rousseau's dive to the Challenger Deep back in 2019, when he picked up a plastic bag at the deepest place on Earth. If we are to tackle this rampant decimation of the oceans with littering and plastics, how is that possible if we can't even let the deepest places on Earth be alone?
I remember that plastic incident, and I remember asking about that. I don't actually know what that was. But regardless, there is actually a place in the Pacific that's known as the Great Pacific Plastic Dump. So whether he picked one up or not, there is a place in the Pacific Ocean that gathers plastic. And I'm pretty sure that you could go through the plastic and find out like who's littering what country. For years, oceans have been abused, with industrial waste. Factories would build on the side of rivers or the side of water, and the assumption was always water would renew. You could just dump anything in there and it would just take care of itself. And I just think it's a dangerous assumption, because I don't know to what extent that there's not lasting damage in that thought process. I know on the Hudson River, for example, there's a nuclear plant shutting down, but they've had spills of, tritium and things like that. You just have an extra molecule, I think, with helium, and you end up with something that has a half-life of 12 years. That's going to kill things. It's going to kill, fish. It's going to kill, wildlife. It's going to kill stuff. So I don't know that any of these things are good. I don't know that. But when you think about pollutants, do you include the shipwrecks? That are sitting in the bottom of the floors. I mean, my God, World War II in the Pacific. How many things are sitting in the bottom of the floors that are full of lead? And when you say like 90% of the sea floors aren't mapped, I mean, and the oceans are 70% of the planet. That's just so much we don't know. And here goes a plane missing, MH370, whatever it is, in the ocean. We can't find it. So, and I have been underwater where I might be a kilometer from a lander. It has a beacon. I have sonar, and I can't find it. So it's just not easy. It's not easy to find things, even if you know where they are. So I think it is a problem, but it also slightly baffles me if I want to be a devil's advocate. If I say, okay, we spent 1.2 trillion on space programs to map the moon and Mars, and let's say that's 19 billion a year annually from when space programs started, what is the return on investment of that? Do you really think we wouldn't have cellular phones? I think that technology would have been with us anyway.
What is scientists hoping to learn from these expeditions to the deepest places on Earth?
So half of NASA's leading indicators for climate change are ocean related. So if I look, I took samples, water samples this time for the Natural History Museum at 10,900 meters. And I was inspired to do that because I saw that the museum had taken water samples from 150 years ago to today and found that single-cell organisms could not grow their shells because of the ocean acidification. So today's water sample to 150 years from today, you know what I'm saying? Like what I was trying to provide today would be to be compared against something 150 years from now, if that made sense. But that's the kind of thing that you can see, which you wouldn't know if you didn't have a comparison. So you see, and to think that, okay, well, half of them might be atmospheric, half of them are ocean, but half is a lot. And the ocean absorbs 25% of our carbon. So if we're worried about, things like, the 2 degrees Celsius or, 1.5 or whatever we're going to end up at, oceans are part of that solution. Plus, we get our food from the sea. Our bodies consist of 60%, 70% water, depending on what organ we're looking at. But as human beings, we are primarily water. So the ocean, to me, is an important part of the makeup for the health of the planet and for the health of human beings.
I'm borrowing a quote from you, Vanessa. No one can take away the knowledge, skills, and experience you acquire throughout your life. Your knowledge, skills, and experience inform your decisions as you move forward. So go ahead, take the biggest step you can. So I'm wondering, what's next for you, Vanessa? You've been to the top of the world, you've been to the lowest part of the world. Sky is not the limit. Will we be expecting you to see you in space soon?
Oh God. Let's see. Space is not currently on the agenda, but I am interested in all sorts of things. I have the book coming out, which has been a labor of love. That was postponed because of COVID, so that will be out in March.
March 2021.
Yes. So I'm, the delay is, it's a temporary delay. That's okay. So it's Simon & Schuster, the U.S. publisher, and then Kirkus is the U.K. publisher, and we've just sold the first foreign rights to Poland for Berta. So that'll be fun, and I think it's funny. So I hope people are able to laugh while they read it, and see some of themselves in it, and it hopefully get some inspiration from it too. And in terms of projects, I mean, I'm always looking for a project. I guess it depends, what it is. The minute I say something, I never know. I'd be interested in everything from finding endurance. Shackleton's ship, Shackleton's anniversary of his death is coming up in 2022. I would love to, see that ship resurrect itself.
Yeah, and not all of the ships, but the photographic plates.
No, they were all broken.
They were all broken. That's correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the reason why they did that on purpose, so they wouldn't go back.
Correct. But I think we could get the bell,
Mm-hmm.
and I think the bell would be pretty cool, and would be a nice visual, symbolic visual stimulus, and maybe even the wheel. But it's not a graveyard, so there's nothing preventing, removing anything. Let me put it that way. But it is 3,000 meters down, so it's deep. And in potentially packed ice. So there's always that, there's just so many things. I think if you're interested, just as long as you have interest, I would also climb again. I mean, Kachinjunga has always been interesting to me. It's the one place I think you don't touch the physical top with something that's been agreed by the local village. It was Mesner's hardest. I think it sounds like a very sacred mountain.
Indeed.
And and at the same time, Pakistan, of course, is a special place. So I always willing to go back there too. So who knows? You can never say never.
So here's the question that I've been waiting for. Would you trade this life that you created now, going back to finance and business developer for Morgan Stanley, Barclays Bank, or Bank of America, or other arbitrary banks?
No.
If they're listening, you're not hired.
Exactly.
For lifetime.
Exactly. No, I think that's probably not the best use of, what I could do right now. But it doesn't mean that there's not things that could be done with those brands should they want to participate in a expedition. I think those brands could be taken somewhere that's very powerful. So should they be listening, I'd happily involve those brands on an expedition. How's that?
I hope so.
Perfect.
If you could give 3 advices to people who feel the urge to undertake an adventurous life as a profession, what would they be?
Let's see. I think if people want to create change, they should they should remember that they have that safety net. They should remember that they have more support than they think they do. And I guess you're talking now about actually doing something different with their life, right?
Correct.
So I think they should see, sometimes you don't really know what you want to do. So there's people who know what they don't want to do, and there's people who know what they want to do. And they both end up in sort of the same place temporarily. But I think it does help to get outside and, maybe take some walks, go on some treks and, clear your mind. And if you clear your mind, you leave some space for some ideas to come to you. And you might be surprised at, what answers, you might find. That has always been popular. People will just stop what they're doing and see what they find. Likewise, you can try something, and if it doesn't work, go back. But, the thing is, you always have that safety net, like right where we started in the beginning. You always have the skills, experience, and knowledge that you have acquired in life that nobody can take away from you. So you don't start off on as much as a back foot as you think you do. You actually start off with a better set of armor than you might imagine. And I know this is a tough time. Like I listen to the telly and people are saying, oh, but I'm worried, I lost my job or I'm furloughed and, I might have to do something new. And, that's okay. I think doing something new, they have to just approach it. Remember when I didn't know how to climb, my first thought was climbing is a skill, and a skill can be taught, not, and learned. You have to think, will you like it and will you be any good at it? Not immediately like, oh no, I don't know how to do it. So go with it in a positive mindset that says, okay, I'll give it a go. Let's see if I like it and if I'm any good at it. That frame of mind is so important because you're not prejudging failure. Making mistakes is part of learning, and that's totally fine.
We all fail.
Failure.
The difference between winner and losers is that winners, they stand up and they continue.
Yeah, it's totally fine. Fall on your ass, slide down the mountain, do all of those things because you're going to get up next time and you're going to know what it feels like, and it's not going to freak you out and scare you. And, you're going to know what to do. It's worse if you don't do those things because it'll happen at the wrong time and you won't know what to do. You want to make all those mistakes early on. And as much in business, as much, in any job that you do, you want to make all the mistakes that you can and learn from them.
Any last words you want to share?
No, I think it's great. I love that you're doing the podcast. I think it's great to share, your knowledge with people and the friends that you've met along the way. So thank you for doing what you're doing.
And thank you for being on the podcast, Vanessa. It's been truly amazing having you here. We touched on base on many topics, and it's been educating and at the same time very entertaining. So if people want to find out more about you, and where should they turn to? Yeah, website's great. It's Victor Oscar Bravo VOBonline.com.